I was 17 when I first heard Michael Reed speak in the school courtyard. His voice carried the weight of someone who had answers to questions I kept hidden. I grew up in Ashford, a suburb of quiet streets and curious glances, where my mother prayed every evening and my father worked too much, leaving me feeling invisible in the spaces between their busy lives. The smell of autumn leaves mixed with the cheap perfume from the girls who clustered around the popular kids. I wasn't one of them. I was the girl who ate lunch alone, reading fantasy novels behind the gymnasium, dreaming of worlds where I mattered. That Tuesday afternoon, Michael's words cut through my isolation like warm honey. "Everyone here is pretending to be someone else," he said to the small group gathered around him. "But what if you could be who you really are? What if you could have real power?" Sarah Williams, my childhood friend, noticed my sudden interest. She touched my arm gently as we walked to the parking lot. "Rebecca, that guy gives me weird vibes," she whispered, her brown eyes full of concern. But I wasn't listening. For the first time in months, someone had looked directly at me and smiled like I was worth knowing. Michael introduced me to a group that met at an older girl's house on Maple Street. The house belonged to Jessica, a 19-year-old dropout with black-painted nails and a confidence I envied. The living room was always dimly lit, heavy curtains blocking the afternoon sun, the air thick with sandalwood incense, and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my skin tingle. "Here, nobody judges you," Jessica explained during my first visit, her voice soft and welcoming. "Here, you can explore who you really are without all the bullshit rules society forces on us." The word felt dangerous and exciting in my mouth when I repeated it later. The group consisted of about 8 teenagers, most older than me. There was Marcus, 21, with piercing blue eyes and tattoos covering his arms. Emma, 18, who spoke in whispers and always wore long black skirts. David, 19, who claimed he could read people's auras. They all seemed so sure of themselves, so connected to something bigger than the meaningless routine of high school and suburban life. On that first night, we sat in a circle on Jessica's burgundy carpet. She lit white candles placed at specific points around the room, creating shadows that danced across our faces. "Tonight, we're going to do something simple," Michael explained, his voice taking on a ceremonial tone. "We're going to make a commitment to ourselves, to our growth, to our power." He handed each of us a red thread, about 6 inches long. "Tie this around your wrist," he instructed. "As you do, repeat after me. I choose to see beyond the veil. I choose to embrace my true nature. I choose power over fear." The words felt ancient in my mouth, important. As I tied the thread around my left wrist, I felt a strange electricity run up my arm. "This thread represents your connection to the group, to the knowledge we'll share with you," Jessica added. "Wear it always. It's a reminder that you're no longer just another sheep following the herd." When I left that evening, the thread felt warm against my skin. I drove home through familiar streets that somehow looked different, as if I was seeing them through new eyes. The convenience store where I bought snacks seemed smaller, shabbier. The houses where my neighbors lived their ordinary lives appeared gray and lifeless. I felt like I was carrying a secret that made me special, elevated above the mundane world around me. At dinner, my mother asked about my day with her usual distracted politeness. My father barely looked up from his smartphone. Neither of them noticed the red thread on my wrist or the new light in my eyes. "Just school stuff," I mumbled, cutting my chicken into small pieces. But inside, I was buzzing with excitement about the next meeting. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from Jessica's living room. The way Michael had looked at me when I spoke. The sense of belonging I felt sitting in that circle. The promise that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. I touched the red thread and whispered the words again. I choose power over fear. I had no idea then how much that simple phrase would cost me, or how long it would take to find my way back to the girl who had walked into that house believing she was gaining something precious, not realizing she was about to lose herself entirely. The thread stayed on my wrist for the next 18 months. When I finally cut it off, my skin underneath was pale and tender, like a wound that had never been allowed to heal. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I was born in the spring of 1987 to parents who loved me, but never quite understood me. My mother, Carmen, was a devout Catholic who worked part-time at the parish office. Her days filled with organizing charity drives and whispering prayers for neighbors she barely knew. She had immigrated from Mexico in the early 80s, carrying dreams of a better life and a rosary that never left her purse. My father, David Martinez, was a second-generation American who managed a small insurance office downtown. He spoke Spanish poorly and prayed even less, but he worked 60-hour weeks to give us the suburban life his parents never had. Our house on Elm Street was modest but clean, with ceramic tiles that my mother mopped every Tuesday and Friday, and a small backyard where she grew tomatoes and marigolds. The smell of her cooking, beans simmering with cilantro, fresh tortillas warming on the comal, filled our kitchen every evening. But I preferred the processed foods my friends ate, embarrassed by the homemade lunches that marked me as different in the school cafeteria. At 17, I was a junior at Ashford High, maintaining a B average that satisfied my parents, but bored me deeply. I had always been drawn to stories about magic and mystery, devouring books about witches and wizards while my classmates focused on fashion magazines and celebrity gossip. My bedroom walls were covered with posters of fantasy movies and gothic artwork I'd printed from the internet. My mother tolerated this as a phase, occasionally reminding me that God is the only real power, mija. Sarah Williams had been my closest friend since 3rd grade, when her family moved to our neighborhood from Portland. She was practical where I was dreamy, cautious where I was impulsive. Her parents were therapists who encouraged emotional expression and critical thinking, concepts that both fascinated and intimidated me. While my family avoided difficult conversations, Sarah's family discussed everything openly, from politics to personal struggles. I envied their ease with complexity. The antagonism in my story wasn't a single person, but a web of influences that made me vulnerable to Michael's group. There was my persistent feeling of invisibility at home and school, where I felt neither smart enough for the honor students nor popular enough for the social elite. There was my frustration with my mother's passive faith, which seemed to require accepting everything without question. There was my father's emotional distance, his way of showing love through providing rather than connecting. Michael Reed himself was 22, a community college dropout who worked part-time at a bookstore specializing in New Age and occult materials. He had shoulder-length brown hair and green eyes that seemed to see straight through people's defenses. He dressed in black jeans and vintage band t-shirts with a leather jacket that smelled like cigarettes and patchouli oil. Women found him attractive in a dangerous way, and men either admired or feared his quiet confidence. Jessica Morrison, who hosted our meetings, came from a wealthy family in the hills above Ashford. Her parents traveled frequently for business, leaving her alone in a house too big for one person. She was studying art at the local community college and worked at a vintage clothing store downtown. Jessica had been involved with occult practices since she was 14, when an older boyfriend introduced her to tarot cards and spell work. She spoke about magic with the casual expertise of someone discussing cooking recipes. The group members each played specific roles in creating an atmosphere of acceptance and specialness. Marcus, with his tattoos and mysterious past, represented the rebel I thought I wanted to be. Emma, with her shy intensity, showed me that quiet girls could still possess power. David, with his talk of auras and energy, made the invisible world seem scientifically legitimate. The objects that would gain significance in my story were already appearing. The red thread, of course, which I wore constantly and touched whenever I felt uncertain. A black candle Jessica gave me for protection, which I hid in my bedroom closet behind old shoeboxes. A small crystal pendant Michael selected for me during our 3rd meeting, claiming it would enhance my natural abilities. Each item felt charged with meaning, like talismans connecting me to a reality more meaningful than homework and family dinners. The group operated on a careful psychology of inclusion and exclusion. They made me feel chosen and special, but also emphasized that this specialness came with obligations. "Not everyone can handle what we're going to teach you," Michael often said, his words carrying the implication that backing out would prove I was weak or ordinary. Our meetings followed a pattern that felt both ritualistic and casual. We would gather on Thursday evenings, when most teenagers were at home doing homework or watching television. Jessica would light incense and candles, while Michael prepared sacred space by walking the perimeter of the room with burning sage. We would sit in our circle, sharing personal struggles and dreams, before moving into guided meditations or simple spell work. The magic we practiced initially was harmless. Visualization exercises for confidence, herb sachets for good luck, group meditations for clarity. But each week, the practices became slightly more intense, the commitments slightly more demanding. Michael introduced concepts of energy exchange and spiritual evolution that made everything sound both ancient and scientific. My relationship with Sarah began to strain as I became more involved with the group. She noticed changes in my behavior, my new vocabulary filled with terms like energy and intention, my increasing secrecy about how I spent my evenings, my irritation when she questioned my new friends. "You're different, Rebecca," she said one afternoon as we walked home from school. "You used to care about things like getting good grades and helping your mom. Now it's like you're somewhere else all the time." But I was somewhere else, living in a world where I was learning to access power I'd never known I possessed. The ordinary concerns of high school felt petty compared to the cosmic significance of the work we were doing. I was becoming someone important, someone with secret knowledge, someone who mattered in ways my family and old friends couldn't understand. The foreshadowing was subtle, but constant. Michael often spoke about deeper levels of commitment that would come when we were ready. Jessica mentioned advanced practices that required complete trust and dedication. The group emphasized loyalty above all else, warning that those who betrayed the group's confidence would face consequences both social and spiritual. I was being prepared for something bigger, something that would require me to choose between my old life and my new identity. I just didn't realize yet how complete that choice would need to be, or how much I would have to sacrifice to prove I was worthy of the power they promised to share. The escalation began subtly in early October, just as the first cold night started creeping into Ashford. Michael introduced what he called trust exercises during our Thursday meetings. These weren't the team-building activities we'd done in gym class, but deeper explorations of vulnerability and loyalty that made my pulse quicken with both excitement and unease. "True power requires absolute honesty," Michael explained during one particularly intense session, his green eyes reflecting the candlelight as he spoke. "You can't access your real potential while hiding behind the masks society taught you to wear." He asked each of us to share our deepest fear, the thing we were most ashamed of, the secret we'd never told anyone. When my turn came, I found myself confessing that I sometimes wished my parents would die in a car accident, not because I hated them, but because I fantasized about the freedom their absence would bring. The words left my mouth before I could stop them, hanging in the incense-heavy air like a confession I could never take back. Instead of judgment, I received nods of understanding and warm touches on my shoulders. "Your honesty is beautiful," Jessica whispered, and I felt both relief and a strange sense of having crossed a line I hadn't known existed. The group began requiring more of my time and attention. Thursday meetings extended past midnight, making it harder to focus in Friday classes. Michael started calling me during the week, long conversations about spiritual development that left me feeling special, but also drained. "Rebecca," he would say in that low, hypnotic voice, "you have more potential than the others, but potential means nothing without dedication." Sarah noticed my increasing exhaustion and tried to intervene. "You look terrible," she said bluntly one Monday morning, studying my face in the harsh fluorescent light of our chemistry classroom. "Your eyes are all bloodshot, and you've lost weight. What's going on with that group?" When I deflected her questions, she pressed harder. "My parents are worried about you. They think you're getting involved in something dangerous." "Your parents don't understand," I snapped, surprised by the venom in my own voice. "They're stuck in their conventional little world, just like everyone else in this stupid town." Sarah's face fell, and I saw hurt replace concern in her expression. But I couldn't apologize. The group had taught me that criticism from outsiders was proof we were doing something important, something that threatened their comfortable ignorance. The practices at our meetings became more elaborate and demanding. We learned to draw complex symbols with consecrated chalk, symbols that Michael claimed were ancient alphabets of power. We began working with what Jessica called blood magic, Nothing dramatic, just pricking our fingers with sterilized needles and letting a drop fall onto petition papers before burning them. Blood carries your essence, she explained matter-of-factly. It makes your intentions more powerful. Each small step felt logical, even necessary. When Michael suggested we fast for 24 hours before meetings to purify our energy, I complied without question. When Jessica asked us to meditate on our shadow selves and embrace the darkness within us, I threw myself into the practice with enthusiasm. When David taught us to shield ourselves from the negative energy of family and friends who didn't understand our path, I practiced the visualization techniques daily. My grades began slipping as my priorities shifted. A history test on the Salem witch trials became an opportunity to write a passionate defense of historical wise women persecuted by Christian authorities. My English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, kept me after class to discuss a short story I'd written about a girl who discovered her magical heritage. "Rebecca," she said gently, "this is well written, but I'm concerned about some of the themes. Are you exploring these ideas in your personal life?" I laughed at her concern, floating on the confidence the group had given me. "Maybe you're just not open to possibilities beyond your limited worldview," I replied, echoing phrases I'd heard Michael use. Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened, and I realized I'd crossed another line, this time with someone who had genuinely cared about my education. The midpoint of my journey came in late November, when Michael announced that some of us were ready for advanced training. He'd been observing our dedication, he explained, and had identified those worthy of deeper secrets. I was among the chosen few, along with Emma and a newer member named Alex, a 19-year-old with hollow eyes and a desperate eagerness to belong. The advanced training took place at a different location, a basement apartment downtown that belonged to someone Michael called his mentor, though we never met this mysterious figure. The space felt different from Jessica's cozy living room. The walls were painted black, covered with symbols I didn't recognize. Shelves lined the room, filled with books in languages I couldn't read, and objects that seemed to pulse with their own energy. "Welcome to the real work," Michael said as he led us down the narrow stairs that first night. The air smelled of old incense and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my throat tighten. "Everything you've learned so far was preparation. Tonight, you begin to access your true potential." The rituals in the basement were more intense than anything we'd done before. We worked with invocations that called upon entities I'd never heard of, names that felt dangerous to speak aloud. Michael taught us to enter trance states through breathing techniques and repetitive chanting, experiences that left me feeling disconnected from my body and temporarily lost in experiences I couldn't quite remember afterward. "The veil between worlds is thinnest when you surrender completely," Michael explained after one particularly disorienting session. "But surrender requires trust. You have to be willing to let go of everything that came before." During these weeks, I began experiencing what I now recognize as psychological manipulation, though at the time, it felt like spiritual growth. Michael would praise my progress one day, then suggest I wasn't committed enough the next. He created a sense of urgency around my development, warning that opportunities for advancement were rare and might not come again. "Some people spend their whole lives searching for what we're offering you," he said during a private conversation after one basement session. "But they're not strong enough to handle the responsibility. I see strength in you, Rebecca, but I also see resistance. You're still holding on to parts of your old life that are keeping you from becoming who you're meant to be." My relationship with my family deteriorated as I became more secretive and defensive. My mother noticed the changes in my behavior, my irritability when she asked about my day, my sudden interest in wearing all black clothing, my refusal to attend Sunday Mass. "Mia, you're worrying me," she said one evening, sitting on my bed while I pretended to do homework. "You seem so angry all the time. Did something happen at school?" I wanted to tell her everything. About the group, about the power I was learning to access, about how alive I felt for the first time in my life. But I also knew she wouldn't understand. Her faith was simple and unquestioning, focused on obedience rather than personal power. "Nothing happened, Mom," I said, not looking up from my textbook. "I'm just growing up." The tension at home increased when my parents discovered some of the books I'd been reading, titles on witchcraft and paganism that I'd borrowed from the group's library. My father, usually passive about family conflicts, became uncharacteristically stern. "This is not what we raised you to believe," he said, holding up a book on Celtic magic. "I don't want this garbage in our house." "It's not garbage," I shot back, standing up to him for the first time in my life. "Just because you don't understand something doesn't make it wrong. Maybe if you actually read instead of just working all the time, you'd know there are other ways to see the world." The fight that followed was our worst ever, ending with me storming out of the house and spending the night at Jessica's. She welcomed me with sympathy and understanding, reinforcing my growing belief that the group was my real family, the only people who truly accepted me. Christmas approached with increasing tension in our household. My mother planned her usual celebration: midnight mass on Christmas Eve, a large family dinner the next day, presents exchanged according to traditions she'd brought from Mexico. But I'd learned from the group that Christmas was a pagan holiday co-opted by Christians, a celebration of materialism and false spirituality. "I'm not participating in your commercial ritual," I announced at dinner one evening in mid-December. "I don't believe in the mythology anymore." My mother's face crumpled as if I'd struck her physically. My father's jaw tightened, and I could see him struggling to find words for disappointment too deep for easy expression. The group celebrated my resistance to family pressure as a sign of spiritual maturity. "Breaking free from inherited beliefs is never easy," Michael told me during one of our phone conversations. "But it's necessary for growth. Your parents will try to pull you back into their limited worldview because your evolution threatens their comfort. Stay strong." By January, I was spending most of my free time with the group, attending meetings 3 times per week and participating in additional activities Michael described as field work, visiting sites around the area that he claimed held special spiritual significance. We conducted rituals at an abandoned church outside town, meditated in a cemetery where Civil War soldiers were buried, and performed what Michael called energy work at a pond hidden deep in the woods behind Jessica's house. During one of these outdoor rituals, conducted under a new moon in temperatures that left our breath visible in cloudy puffs, Michael announced that some of us were ready for the next level of commitment. "True power," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent water, "requires sacrifice. Not the meaningless sacrifice of giving up chocolate for Lent, but real sacrifice, giving up the parts of yourself that no longer serve your higher purpose." He looked directly at me as he spoke, and I felt chosen in a way that made my chest tight with anticipation and fear. "Rebecca," he said, "you've shown more growth than anyone in the group. You're ready to take the final step, to bind yourself permanently to the power you've been cultivating. But it means leaving behind everything that connects you to your old life, everything and everyone." The ritual he described would take place on my 18th birthday in March, just 6 weeks away. It would involve what he called a spiritual contract, a commitment that would unlock abilities I'd only glimpsed so far. But it would also require cutting all ties with family and friends who didn't understand my path. "Think carefully," he said as we walked back to the cars that night, the frozen ground crunching under our feet. "This is a one-time opportunity. Once you commit, there's no going back. You'll be part of something ancient and powerful, but you'll also be beyond the reach of ordinary human relationships." I drove home through empty streets, my mind racing with possibilities and fears I couldn't sort through. The red thread on my wrist felt tighter than usual, as if it was cutting off circulation to my hand. In 6 weeks, I would have to choose between the life I'd known for 18 years and the promise of power that seemed to shimmer just beyond my reach. I had no idea that in making that choice, I would discover things about myself, about the group, and about the nature of real power that would change everything I thought I understood about the path I'd been walking. My 18th birthday fell on a Thursday in March, and I woke that morning with a mixture of anticipation and dread that made my stomach churn. The ritual Michael had described was scheduled for that evening, and I'd spent the previous week in a state of nervous preparation that left me barely able to eat or sleep. The day itself felt surreal, disconnected from normal time. My mother had made my favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with cheese and fresh salsa, but I could only manage a few bites before pushing the plate away. She watched me with worried eyes, clearly wanting to say something, but not knowing how to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the past months. "Mija," she finally said, her voice soft and careful. 18 is important. You're becoming a woman today. Whatever is happening in your life, whatever you're going through, remember that you always have a home here. I nodded without really listening, my mind already focused on the evening ahead. Michael had given me specific instructions. Wear all black, bring nothing from my past life, arrive exactly at sunset. He'd emphasized that this ritual would change everything, that after tonight I would be beyond the reach of ordinary human limitations. At school, I moved through my classes like a ghost, unable to concentrate on anything my teachers said. Sarah tried to approach me at lunch, carrying a small wrapped gift and wearing an expression of tentative hope. "Rebecca," she said, sitting down across from me in the cafeteria, "I know things have been weird between us, but it's your birthday. I wanted to give you this." The gift was a silver bracelet with a small cross charm, simple and elegant. "My grandmother gave it to me when I turned 16, Sarah explained. "She said it would protect me from making decisions I'd regret. I thought maybe—" She trailed off, clearly sensing my withdrawal. "I can't accept this," I said, pushing the box back across the table. "I don't believe in that symbolism anymore." Sarah's face fell, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. Part of me wanted to take back my words, to apologize, to ask her to help me think through what I was about to do. But a larger part, the part that had been carefully cultivated over months of group meetings, whispered that her tears were proof of her weakness, her inability to understand my evolution. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. I sat in my room, staring at the black clothes I'd laid out on my bed, a long skirt, a fitted top, boots that Michael had specifically requested. The outfit looked like a costume for someone I wasn't sure I wanted to become, but I'd committed to this path too deeply to turn back now. At 5 o'clock, I left a note on my pillow. "Gone to celebrate with friends. Don't wait up." It was the truth, technically, though I suspected my parents wouldn't recognize the celebration I was planning to attend. The drive to the basement apartment felt like a descent into another world. The familiar streets of Ashford looked strange in the late afternoon light, as if I was seeing them for the last time. When I arrived, the other participants were already there. Emma, Alex, and 2 newer members I barely knew. Michael greeted me with unusual formality, taking my hands in his and looking directly into my eyes. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before, "are you ready to leave your old self behind and embrace your true nature?" The basement had been transformed for the ritual. Candles covered every surface, their flames creating a warm, flickering light that made the painted symbols on the walls seem to move. A large circle had been drawn on the floor in what looked like white chalk, though it had a strange, luminous quality that suggested something more exotic. At the center of the circle sat a small wooden table covered with objects I didn't immediately recognize. A black-handled knife, a leather-bound book, a silver cup filled with dark liquid. "Tonight," Michael explained as we took our positions around the circle, "you will sign a contract with powers far older and more significant than anything the mundane world can offer. This contract will grant you abilities most humans can't even imagine, but it requires total commitment. Once signed, it cannot be broken." He opened the leather book to a page covered with text in a language I couldn't read, though the words seemed to pulse with their own energy as I stared at them. "The contract is written in the old tongue," he continued, "but its meaning is simple. You pledge your complete loyalty to the group and to the entities we serve. In return, they pledge to grant you power over the natural world and over other people." Emma signed first, pricking her finger with the black knife and letting a drop of blood fall onto the page. Her face was serene, almost ecstatic, as she spoke words that Michael whispered in her ear. Alex followed, his hands shaking slightly as he made his commitment. The 2 newer members signed without hesitation, clearly eager to prove their dedication. When my turn came, I felt a moment of crushing clarity that took my breath away. As I reached for the knife, I suddenly understood that this wasn't about gaining power. It was about surrendering it. The contract wouldn't make me stronger. It would make me dependent on the group's approval for my sense of self-worth. The entities Michael spoke of weren't ancient gods, but psychological constructs designed to justify manipulation and control. "Rebecca," Michael said, his voice now carrying an edge of impatience. "It's time." I picked up the knife, feeling its weight in my hand. The blade was sharp and cold, and for a moment I imagined how easy it would be to draw it across my finger, to let my blood join the others on the ancient page. Around me, the candlelight flickered, and the assembled group waited in expectant silence. But instead of cutting my finger, I set the knife back down on the table. "No," I said, the word coming out stronger and clearer than I'd expected. "I'm not signing this." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, confusion, anger, and finally a cold calculation that made my skin crawl. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "you're experiencing last-minute nerves. That's normal, but you've come too far to back out now." "I haven't come far enough," I replied, standing up and stepping back from the circle. "I've been running away from my real life for months, and I'm tired of running. This isn't power, it's just another way of being controlled." Emma looked at me with eyes full of hurt and confusion. "Rebecca, you don't understand what you're giving up," she pleaded. "We're your real family now. Out there, you're nobody. Here, you're special. Maybe being nobody is better than being somebody who has to cut herself to prove her worth," I said, surprised by my own clarity. The words seemed to come from a part of myself I'd forgotten existed, the part that had questioned and doubted even as I'd thrown myself deeper into the group's embrace. Michael stood up slowly, his earlier mask of spiritual wisdom replaced by something much colder and more calculating. "If you leave now," he said quietly, "you'll never be welcome back. You'll lose everyone who really understands you. Your old friends won't take you back after how you've treated them. Your family will never trust you again. You'll be completely alone." His words hit their target, awakening the fear of isolation that had driven me to the group in the first place. For a moment I wavered, imagining the lonely life he described. But then I remembered Sarah's tears in the cafeteria, my mother's worried face at breakfast, the note I'd left on my pillow. Those people had loved me before I'd learned to access any kind of power, and maybe that love was more real than anything the group could offer. "Maybe alone is better than this," I said, walking toward the stairs that led back to the ordinary world. "Maybe being loved for who I am is better than being praised for who you want me to become." As I climbed the stairs, I heard Michael's voice calling after me. "You'll regret this, Rebecca. When you're 30 and working some meaningless job, married to some boring man, living some small suburban life, you'll remember this night and wish you'd been brave enough to choose differently." I didn't turn around to answer, but I thought, maybe that boring life is exactly what I want. Maybe ordinary love is the most powerful magic there is. The drive home from that basement felt like emerging from underwater. Everything seemed brighter, clearer, more real than it had in months. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I navigated the familiar streets of Ashford, the red thread around my wrist feeling like a chain I couldn't wait to remove. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the warm light spilling from our kitchen window. Inside, my parents were sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee and worried expressions that suggested they'd been waiting up despite my note. My mother looked up when I entered, her eyes immediately scanning my face for signs of whatever trouble she'd been imagining. "Mija," she said softly, "are you okay? You look different," my father finished, setting down his coffee cup and studying me with the focused attention he usually reserved for insurance documents. "You look like yourself again." I realized he was right. For the first time in months, I felt like Rebecca Martinez rather than some idealized version of myself the group had been constructing. The weight of pretending to be someone I wasn't had lifted from my shoulders, leaving me both relieved and exhausted. "I need to tell you something," I said, sitting down at the table across from them. "I've been involved with a group, and tonight I realized it wasn't what I thought it was. I'm sorry for how I've been acting. I'm sorry for pushing you away." My mother reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers warm and familiar. She didn't ask for details or demand explanations. She simply held my hand and said, "Welcome home, Mija." But leaving the group wasn't as simple as walking out of that basement. Over the following days, I experienced what I now understand was a form of withdrawal from the intense community and artificial sense of purpose the group had provided. I felt disoriented, empty, unsure of who I was, without their constant reinforcement of my specialness. Michael called repeatedly, his messages growing increasingly desperate and then angry. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he said in one voicemail. "You think your suburban family is going to fulfill you? You think those shallow high school friendships matter? You'll be crawling back within a week, begging us to take you back." Emma sent long text messages describing how hurt and betrayed the group felt by my abandonment. "We trusted you with sacred knowledge," she wrote. "We opened our hearts to you, and you threw it all away because you got scared. Do you have any idea how selfish that is?" The psychological pressure was intense, designed to make me doubt my decision and return to the group out of guilt and loneliness. But something had shifted during that moment in the basement when I'd refused to sign the contract. I'd remembered who I was beneath all the layers of identity the group had helped me construct. The hardest part was rebuilding the relationships I'd damaged during my months of involvement. Sarah had been hurt deeply by my rejection of her friendship and the cruel things I'd said during my period of group-induced superiority. When I finally worked up the courage to call her, she listened to my apology in silence before saying, "Rebecca, I'm glad you're okay, but I need time to think about this." I understood her hesitation. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair easily. I'd spent months treating her like she was inferior, dismissing her concerns, making her feel small for caring about ordinary things like schoolwork and family traditions. My apology, however sincere, couldn't immediately undo that damage. At school, I faced the social consequences of my behavior during the previous months. Teachers who had tried to help me remembered my arrogant responses to their concern. Classmates who had attempted to maintain friendships recalled my dismissive attitude toward their mundane interests. I'd burned bridges systematically, convinced that I was evolving beyond the need for such ordinary relationships. Reconstructing my identity without the group's constant reinforcement required patience and humility. I had to relearn how to find meaning in small things, getting good grades on tests, helping my mother with household chores, watching silly movies with my father on weekend evenings. These activities had once seemed beneath me, too ordinary for someone accessing cosmic power. Now I discovered they contained their own quiet satisfaction. The red thread came off my wrist one evening in late March, about 2 weeks after leaving the group. I'd been avoiding removing it, partly from habit and partly from a superstitious fear that some of the group's warnings about consequences might be real. But as I sat in my bedroom, looking at the pale band of skin underneath the thread, I realized I was ready to let go of that symbol completely. I cut it off with a pair of scissors from my desk drawer. The thread fell to the floor like a small red snake, and I felt a physical sensation of release, as if I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. I threw it in the trash can next to my bed, then immediately retrieved it and flushed it down the toilet, not wanting any trace of it in my personal space. My relationship with my mother deepened as I began to appreciate the strength it had taken for her to immigrate to a new country, learn a new language, and build a life for her family. Her faith, which I'd previously dismissed as simple-minded, revealed itself as a source of genuine comfort and community. I didn't return to attending Mass regularly, but I stopped mocking her devotion and began asking genuine questions about what her beliefs meant to her. My father and I started having real conversations for the first time in years. He told me about his own period of rebellion as a teenager, when he'd rejected his parents' traditional expectations and briefly considered dropping out of high school to join a band. "I thought conformity was the enemy," he said one evening as we worked together in the garage, organizing tools. "It took me a while to understand that sometimes conformity is just another word for belonging to something bigger than yourself." The physical symptoms of leaving the group were unexpected and unsettling. I experienced headaches that lasted for days, probably from stress and the disruption of my sleep patterns. My appetite disappeared for almost a week, leaving me lightheaded and shaky. I had vivid dreams about the basement rituals and would wake up with my heart racing, unsure for several minutes whether I was still trapped in that candlelit circle. Most disturbing were the moments of doubt that crept in during quiet times. Had I made a mistake? Had I given up something genuinely valuable because I was too scared to embrace my full potential? The group had taught me to interpret any doubts about their teachings as evidence of weakness or outside manipulation. so questioning my decision to leave felt dangerous and forbidden. I found help in unexpected places. Mrs. Patterson, my English teacher, noticed my improved attitude in class and asked me to stay after school one day. "I can see you've worked through whatever was troubling you earlier this year," she said carefully. "If you ever want to talk about it, or if you need resources for dealing with difficult social situations, I'm here." I didn't tell her the whole story, but I appreciated knowing that someone had noticed my struggle and cared enough to offer support. Her classroom became a safe space where I could focus on academic work and remember what it felt like to be good at something purely through effort and intelligence. Sarah and I slowly rebuilt our friendship over the spring months. She remained cautious, testing my sincerity through small interactions before gradually increasing our time together. Our first real conversation after my apology happened during a study session for our history final. She asked simply, "What was it like, being in that group?" "Like being addicted to feeling special," I answered after thinking for several minutes. They made me believe I was discovering who I really was, but I was actually becoming who they wanted me to be. And the scariest part is how good it felt, right up until the moment I realized I was about to disappear completely. Sarah nodded, and I could see understanding rather than judgment in her expression. "I'm glad you found your way back," she said quietly. "I missed my friend." By May, 3 months after leaving the group, I felt stable enough to look back at the experience analytically. I wrote a long journal entry cataloging the manipulation techniques I'd experienced, the love bombing at the beginning, the gradual isolation from outside relationships, the creation of artificial urgency around spiritual development, the use of shame and fear to enforce compliance. The exercise was both therapeutic and educational. I began to understand how normal, intelligent people could be drawn into destructive situations through the exploitation of universal human needs for belonging, purpose, and significance. I wasn't stupid or weak. I'd been systematically manipulated by people who understood human psychology and used that knowledge to serve their own needs for power and control. Summer arrived with a sense of new beginning. I got a job at the public library, shelving books and helping with children's reading programs. The work was ordinary in the best possible way, useful, straightforward, connected to my community. My coworkers were kind people who cared about literacy and learning, and being around them reminded me that there were many ways to find meaning and purpose without claiming access to cosmic secrets. On my 19th birthday in March of the following year, I drove past the bookstore where Michael had worked. It was closed, with a "For Lease" sign in the window. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that his influence in the community had ended, sadness for whatever pain or failure had led to that ending. I never learned what happened to most of the group members, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that Emma had eventually left as well and was attending college in another state. I hoped she'd found her way back to herself as I had, but I knew that not everyone who entered such groups was lucky enough to escape before suffering more serious damage. The experience changed me permanently, but not in the ways the group had promised. Instead of gaining supernatural powers, I'd learned to recognize manipulation and trust my own judgment. Instead of accessing cosmic secrets, I'd discovered the value of ordinary human relationships and everyday responsibilities. Instead of becoming someone special, I'd remembered how to be myself. Now, 15 years later, I sit in my small office at the community college where I work as a counselor, helping young people navigate the challenges of early adulthood. The irony isn't lost on me that I've found my way back to a form of guidance work, but this time with transparency, professional boundaries, and genuine care for my students' well-being rather than my own need for power or control. My desk holds the ordinary treasures of a life well lived. Photos of my husband Marcus and our 8-year-old daughter Sophia, a coffee mug that reads, "World's Okayest Mom," a gift from Sophia that makes me smile every morning, and a small succulent plant that somehow thrives despite my inconsistent watering schedule. These simple objects ground me in a reality that feels infinitely more magical than anything I experienced during those months with Michael's group. Marcus and I met during my senior year of college, in a psychology class focused on cult dynamics and recovery. He was writing his thesis on manipulation techniques in high-control groups, and I was finally ready to share my story as research data. Our first conversations were academic, but they evolved into something deeper as we discovered a shared understanding of how vulnerable people could be exploited by those who claimed to offer salvation or enlightenment. Our wedding was small and joyful, held in my parents' backyard with Sarah as my maid of honor and my mother's roses in full bloom. We wrote our own vows, promising to support each other's growth while respecting each other's autonomy, a commitment that felt especially meaningful given my history with manipulative relationships. My father walked me down the makeshift aisle, whispering in Spanish that he was proud of the woman I'd become. Sophia arrived 3 years later, a healthy, curious baby who transformed our understanding of love and responsibility. Holding her for the first time, I felt a fierce protectiveness that made me understand, in a visceral way, how my own parents must have suffered during my months of pulling away from them. I called my mother from the hospital room, crying as I apologized again for the pain I'd caused and thanking her for never giving up on me. Parenting has taught me lessons about real power that I never learned in that candlelit basement. True strength, I've discovered, comes from setting consistent boundaries with love, from admitting when you're wrong, from putting someone else's needs before your own, without losing yourself in the process. These skills are harder to develop than any ritual magic, but they create genuine transformation in the world. My work at the college brings me into contact with students who remind me of my 18-year-old self, young people searching for identity and belonging, vulnerable to anyone who offers easy answers or promises of specialness. I've learned to recognize the signs: sudden changes in friend groups, new vocabulary that sounds rehearsed, defensive reactions to gentle questions about new influences in their lives. Last semester, a student named Jessica, the name always makes me pay extra attention, came to my office after her roommate expressed concern about her involvement with a spiritual study group that was demanding increasing amounts of her time and money. As she described the group's practices, I heard echoes of my own experience: the love bombing, the gradual isolation, the creation of artificial urgency around spiritual development. "They say I have special gifts," Jessica told me, her eyes bright with the same excitement I remembered feeling. "They've chosen me for advanced training. I just need to prove my commitment by cutting ties with negative influences." Instead of lecturing her about manipulation techniques, I shared pieces of my own story. I told her about the red thread, about the moment I'd almost signed that contract, about the long process of rebuilding relationships I'd damaged. I watched her face change as she recognized parallels to her own experience. "What made you stop?" she asked, leaning forward in her chair. "I realized I was about to disappear," I said simply. "The person they wanted me to become wasn't me. It was their idea of what I should be. And I decided I'd rather be an ordinary version of myself than an extraordinary version of someone else." Jessica left my office that day with printed resources about healthy versus unhealthy group dynamics, and my business card with a note that she could call any time. 3 weeks later, she stopped by to tell me she'd left the group and was seeing a therapist to work through the experience. These moments remind me why I chose this profession, why my own difficult experience became the foundation for helping others. Sarah and I remain close friends, though she lives across the country now with her own family. We text regularly and visit when possible, our friendship strengthened by having survived that period of strain. She often reminds me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, but about choosing to believe that people can change and grow from their mistakes. My relationship with my parents deepened as I matured and began to understand the sacrifices they'd made for our family. My mother and I cook together when I visit, her hands guiding mine as she teaches me the recipes she learned from her own mother. My father and Sophia have developed a special bond. He speaks to her in Spanish, teaching her songs he learned as a child, giving her the cultural connection I'd rejected but learned to value. The community college where I work is located just 20 minutes from Ashford, and sometimes I drive through my old neighborhood after appointments. The house where I grew up looks smaller now, the teenage dramas that once felt cosmic reduced to their proper proportions by time and experience. The street where Sarah and I walk to school every day is lined with the same oak trees, older and taller, their roots cracking the sidewalk in new places. I never see anyone from the old group during these drives, though I occasionally wonder what became of them. Emma, I learned through social media, completed college and works as a social worker in Oregon. She posted a photo last year of herself at a conference on trauma recovery, and I felt proud of her for finding a way to transform her own difficult experience into service to others. I haven't heard anything about Michael in years, and I prefer it that way. Understanding his psychology helped my own healing process, but I have no desire to maintain any connection to that chapter of my life beyond the lessons it taught me. The red thread is long gone, but I still notice the faint scar on my wrist where it rubbed against my skin for so many months. Sophia asks about it sometimes, and I tell her it's a reminder that promises that seem too good to be true usually are. When she's older, I'll share more of the story, but for now, simple truths are enough. In my office, I keep a small framed quote that a former student gave me. The most radical thing you can do is think for yourself. It sits next to my computer, visible whenever I'm writing emails or preparing for counseling sessions. Some days, when I'm feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of human nature and the endless ways people find to hurt each other, that quote reminds me that individual critical thinking is both powerful and subversive. My faith evolved rather than disappeared. I don't attend church regularly, but I've developed a quiet spiritual practice centered on gratitude, service, and the recognition that love, ordinary, imperfect, human love, is the closest thing to magic most of us will ever encounter. I pray sometimes, simple conversations with whatever force governs the universe, thanking it for second chances and asking for wisdom in my work with students. Marcus and I talk often about how to raise Sophia with both openness to spiritual questions and strong critical thinking skills. We want her to explore ideas and develop her own beliefs, but we also want her to recognize manipulation when she encounters it. It's a delicate balance, protecting her innocence while preparing her for a world where predators often wear the masks of saviors. The experience taught me that belonging doesn't require surrendering your autonomy, that love doesn't demand you become someone else, and that real power comes from taking responsibility for your choices rather than claiming access to forces beyond ordinary human experience. These lessons sound simple, but living them requires daily practice and constant vigilance against the very human tendency to seek easy answers to complex questions. This morning, Sophia asked me what I do at work, and I told her I help people remember who they are when they get confused about who they're supposed to be. She nodded solemnly, the way children do when they sense they're receiving important information they're not quite ready to understand fully. Tonight, after she's asleep and the dishes are done, I'll sit on our back porch with Marcus, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. We'll talk about ordinary things, work challenges, weekend plans, Sophia's progress in school, and I'll feel grateful for the simple miracle of a life lived in truth, surrounded by people who love me for exactly who I am. The girl who walked into that candlelit living room at 17 was searching for magic in all the wrong places. The woman writing this story has learned that the real magic was always here, in the courage to be authentic, in the choice to love without losing yourself, in the daily decision to build something meaningful from the ordinary materials of human existence. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with your experience. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.